Today I'm with Dara Macdonald. Dara is a Sydney-based lawyer who runs a private members club for free speech. It's called All Minus One. She also writes for various publications, including Quillette, and has her own Substack. She's also a member or a director of the newly formed Free Speech Union in Australia. The Free Speech Union originates from the UK and was founded by former Quillette editor Toby Young. So Dara, why does Australia need its own Free Speech Union?
Well, because not everyone, and this is something that is often brought up by critics of cancel culture or the concept of cancel culture. They say it's a battle between elites. You look at J.K. Rowling, all these people that have been quote unquote cancelled or mobbed, they have the ability to fight it. They have resources. No one's being harmed. But this is to miss the fact that ordinary people are also caught up in these battles. And when you have a free speech union, you have someone that can support these people that are ordinary people with ordinary jobs that have been mobbed online or subject to workplace disciplinary actions for very innocuous speech, really.
So do we have any recent examples of that in Australia that you can talk about?
We've only just started in Australia, so we haven't gotten the volume of cases that you would have in, say, the UK, and in New Zealand also has a free speech union. And when you have a free speech union, you do see these cases. For instance, there was one in New Zealand where there was a mortician who was subject to workplace disciplinary action because she misgendered a cadaver, so a dead body. Arguably, no one is offended because the person is dead. And clearly, if you've only see someone on your table and you assume that they look like a man, you would say, this is one of those like kind of crazy examples, but things that happen in real life. These aren't people that are being political or, being intentionally provocative. These are just people that are, overstepping the mark of what is polite to say in our society and the taboos that we've decided are the thing. Even though we've just started, we have a few cases, some of which I'm not allowed to talk about at the moment because they're subject to legal action. But by the most part, there's a lot of cases of civil servants, university professors, these sorts of people. But there's also cases which have come to our attention. One which I can talk about is one involving a 10-year-old autistic girl.
I have heard a bit about this one.
Yeah, and it is really, honestly, I find it quite cruel that people that exclaim that words of violence, but yet are willing to go down the road of, and this case involves this 10-year-old autistic girl that was suspended from her school for basically questioning why there is someone with boy parts, quote unquote, in the female toilets. Now, this is something that is a live debate in our society at the moment. This is something that adults can't really work out. We're currently fighting it out where where trans rights start and where female rights and to female spaces begin. And so we're currently fighting about this in a society, and we expect 10-year-olds, let alone 10-year-old autistic children, which, clearly with a diagnosis of autism, this is someone that is going to struggle with negotiating social situations, some social situations that we're already struggling with as adults. And we're expecting them to be able to negotiate that situation without offending anyone. It is completely unreasonable, to be honest, and quite cruel, I would say. And, we have brought this to the attention of the Department of Education and the school, that this is possibly even amounting to unlawful discrimination on the basis of disability, because obviously this is someone who is very vulnerable and has different needs in terms of understanding social situations.
So how will the Free Speech Union work here? People like the aggrieved parties, for example, the parent of this child comes to you and asks for your support, and what sort of support can you provide them?
So the one with the case against the school, this is something that we've taken on without being approached by the parents because we think it's a completely cruel situation. We don't want to see, children expelled or suspended from school and deprived in education because they can't navigate a social situation that we as adults are struggling to negotiate. So that's something we have taken on.
Public interest.
Public interest grounds. So we do have that function that if we see something that is completely ridiculous and, completely cruel, we will jump in and defend. But for the most part, we work as a union. So people come, they join up as a member. There's some fees on our website, freespeechunion.au. And if you get in trouble, at the moment we're a very skeletal organisation, so the support that we can offer is very bare bones. But as we build up resources and members, we hopefully will be able to function as a completely fully fledged union where we can come in and defend our members if they're subject to workplace disciplinary action or some other adverse action based on something they say.
I can see on your website one of the core value is reclaim larrikinism, which I like.
So we wanted this, we have free speech unions in other parts of the world. Obviously the original one is in UK, but because this is the Free Speech Union of Australia, we wanted it to have a particular Australian flavour. And reclaim larrikinism is one of those things that is not just free speech because it's useful, it's not just free speech because it's part of a functioning democracy, which is all very, that's all very true, but free speech because it's also fun. Like, we don't want to walk around in a society where we always have to walk on eggshells and worry if we're offending people. We can, throw out comments out there and okay, people will be offended, but that's part of the Australian spirit, is that we are very straightforward with our speech. We are very, we can be very cutting at times. And I think we need to be able to still have that flavour of our culture.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I like that one.
Yeah.
So how did you come to be a director of the Free Speech Union? Did someone approach you or did you?
I approached Toby quite a few years ago, to be honest. I started the process back in 2001, I think.
Wow.
Of talking to him, or maybe early 2002. And then I nothing really happened because I didn't have other people that were interested in starting in Australia. And then my co-director, Ruben, which is a Monash Uni professor, came on board, and a few other people galvanised again around having a free speech union in Australia. And from that, really, with the support and the skills that they came on board with, that was what made it possible to start it in Australia. We still all have our day jobs. We are not being paid for this. We're kind of doing it as a public service at the moment.
So I know you're a lawyer. Do you work in the free speech
space? No.
Would you like to?
Yeah, sure, but it's not really a viable. It's not like America where you have a First Amendment and there's a lot of litigation that happens in that space. Look, I'm also happy to divorce my day job from my hobby in some respect. Like I work as a commercial lawyer, but it's also nice to have a little bit of a separation and do something different outside. So it's either or is fine.
Yeah. And how long have you been interested in free speech for?
Long time. It's one of those things or those values that have not changed throughout my life, basically. So I grew up in what is, the hippie world of Australia. I grew up near Nimbin, in Byron Bay, in that sort of northern New South Wales area. I went to a neo-humanist school.
Wow.
So I had a very hippie kind of education where we meditated and sung every day and had a whole term off to do a school play. So I had a very kind of this sort of old left upbringing. So I was part of this kind of subculture where free speech was very much valued, but also other sort of left-wing ideas like, environmental protection and these sorts of things were very much part of my childhood. When I moved away and went to university, I was quite shocked, to be honest, because when I got there, despite universities being very left-wing, they were not the sort of left-wing that I was used to coming from this kind of hippie upbringing. And one of the real flashpoints for me was actually a free speech case that happened when I was studying law. It was the infamous Section 18C case with Andrew Bolt. So this was one of the real flashpoints for Australia in free speech, and I was studying down the road from the court, so I was wandering up in my lunch break and having a look at the proceedings. And what was really interesting is that I came down on the issues in question very differently to what a lot of the people that I was studying with.
Can you outline the basic facts of that case for people who aren't familiar?
This is to do with a piece of legislation we have in Australia called the Racial Discrimination Act. And Section 18C of it says that it's unlawful to offend, harass, and humiliate someone on the basis of race. The key point of that is offend, because that's a very low bar. It's a very low bar to offend someone. And this particular commentator who is very famous in Australia, Andrew Bolt, had written these
known
pieces.
as one of our, he's like the Piers Morgan of Australia, so Tucker Carlson.
Yeah, so well-established commentator on the right. And he had written these pieces about people who could, shall we say, pass as non-Indigenous or have claimed Indigenous ancestry in order to benefit from all the things that Australia does as a country to try and, uplift the Indigenous community in Australia, which is obviously a big issue now with the voice vote and everything. But so this had been published, a few pieces, and a group of Indigenous or aggrieved people that had been name called in his article had taken this case against him. Interestingly enough, some of them have come out and said they've regretted taking this action. For instance, Bindi Cole, the artist, which was named, she's come and basically come full circle and has now decided that the Section 18C of the Racial Discrimination Act is not a good thing, and has made good with Andrew Bolt on Live on Air and everything. So it's interesting that some of the people that were part of this this court case are now on good terms with Andrew Bolt.
Yeah.
So the issue in question was whether these pieces were able to be published and whether they would infringe Section 18C of the Racial Discrimination Act, which the Federal Court of Australia decided it did. So, yes. So that was a big flashpoint, because that means that saying what Andrew Bolt said in these pieces is now, unlawful.
So how did your interpretation of that differ from your...
Well, I basically said that we shouldn't have a provision that made it unlawful to offend someone. I think that's completely ludicrous. I've always been very pro free speech, pretty much a absolutist, and my fellow students at university had definitely didn't have that view, and thought that first of all, the decision against Andrew Bolt was correct, and also that making it illegal to offend someone on the basis of race, amongst other characteristics, is completely legitimate.
Since then, have there been other high-profile legal cases using Section 18C?
Yeah, there have. There has been one, particularly the QUT case, which involved some students who were in a apparently non-signposted, but should have been clear that it was an Indigenous-only computer lab.
Oh, okay.
And they posted
at Queensland
University of Technology, and they were kicked out of it. And they posted on the channel within the university, or maybe it was Facebook, I can't remember, that they had just been kicked out of an Indigenous computer lab. And from that, the professor in question that had kicked them out of it took issue with it and started a complaint process with the Australian Human Rights Commission against them under Section 18 of the Racial Discrimination Act. Many of the students settled. A few of them took it further and took it to the federal court. And in that case, actually, it was thrown out. They were acquitted. And so that is also interesting in the sense that the Australian Human Rights Commission, if it had been dealt with in that, would have considered this to be problematic, and the complainant in this case was awarded damages from them. But when it went to court, it was thrown out, which is interesting as well.
So most of our readers and listeners are not based in Australia. What do you think they need to know about free speech in Australia? What are the main differences when it comes to other countries like the United States or England?
Well, the key point between Australia and US, for instance, is that there's no such thing as a right to free speech in Australia. We do have what is this is very wonky constitutional law, but there have been a few cases in Australia that have decided that there is an implied right of political communication or implied freedom of political communication. There's no wording to that effect in the Constitution. It's just our judges, when they've looked at the Constitution, they've decided that it was clearly democratic and therefore there has to be some ability to speak freely on political matters. So that is one protection, if you want, but it's based on this very kind of in the vibe of the thing interpretation of our constitution, and therefore it's very likely that it could be taken away or read down or rescinded by future justices. So yeah, there is a little bit of a implied freedom in our constitution, but otherwise we don't have a constitutional protection for free speech.
Using a recent example, so on Monday, a crowd of hundreds of people joined a Pro-Palestinian march in Sydney. They marched from Town Hall to the Opera House, and I'm sure many people will have seen that at the Opera House they were shouting things that are quite abhorrent about Jewish people, even inciting, gas the Jews, asking that Jewish people be killed. What are your thoughts on that when it comes to freedom of speech? Should that be allowed to happen in your eyes? What are your thoughts on that?
My view personally is that actually free speech is necessary in this circumstance as well. To be honest, I'm very happy that we know who these people are, that they felt free enough to shout the horrid things that they did on the steps of the Opera House. I prefer to know that they hold those views rather than they be underground holding those views. So in that respect, I'm actually very happy we live in a free society where they felt free enough to be able to engage in that behaviour. Interestingly enough, one of the little bits of research that I did is I compared countries that have very strict, and for good reason, historically very strict, particularly in Germany and countries where they've completely banned the swastika. They're not allowed to say any, have very harsh penalties for any kind of anti-Semitic speech. And when I looked at the data, most of the anti-Semitic incidents that happened in those countries. Which is not necessarily a causal effect in the sense that I'm sure, to put it bluntly, a lot of those incidents are more driven by the immigration policies of those countries rather than whether they have this law on the books or not. But the interesting thing is that the law didn't help in that instance. So in terms of actually violent behaviour, it seems that having hate speech laws, quote unquote, on the books doesn't actually result in there being a diminution of actual violent incidences or hate crimes, if you want to say.
So when you say that you're a free speech absolutist or almost an absolutist, what's your
where do I draw the line?
Yeah,
I mean, I think very much in line with what the decisions around the First Amendment are in the US. So, for instance, direct incitements of violence. Obviously, that's off the table. Anything that directly causes harm to someone. None of this sort of, fuzzy. It could, it merely offends, or it's even really serious incitements. I would say the instance with the incidents on the steps of the Opera House, none of those people had the ability to carry out that right there, right now. Therefore, I wouldn't say that that's an incitement in the direct sense that they directly were able to carry out that at that point. But it is still obviously, it is still very awful, awful language.
It's still horrent.
So
the difference would be if they were saying, kill Jews, and they had weapons there, because still, I mean, you can kill someone without a weapon.
I mean, this is the kind of the classic example given in John Stuart Mill on Liberty of there's a guy that's standing out the front of a corn farmer's house and saying all these things about corn farmers, or I can't remember the example exactly, but because there's the mob outside the house at that point, that would definitely be considered an incitement to violence, because clearly they're about to go mob the guy, So I think context where the speech happens is also key in that sense. Like if people posting I want to, I've had a few of those, like, I want to rape you kind of thing on Twitter, like you get all those kind of, comments that you get from abhorrent people on Twitter, but they have no ability to carry that out. They don't know who I am. They're a million miles away. They're some fox, or anon account.
Yes.
So
An
in that
anime character, anime fox
character,
usually.
yeah. So they have no ability to carry that threat out necessarily. So I wouldn't consider that an incitement to violence, in the sense that context matters.
Okay, so what about the case of J.K. Rowling in the UK? Because it seems in that case that it started online, it started on Twitter, and then people actually rocked up to her house, if I understand correctly.
Yeah.
Was the Free Speech Union in the UK involved in that case?
I'm actually unsure. I think with J.K. Rowling, she's big enough that she's been able to handle this matter on her own.
Right.
I assume we offered, but I'm not sure. So in that instance, this is a direct action. I would say that it's one thing to say something; it's another thing to rock up at the house and be intimidating.
Yes.
And I guess this is where really the line is drawn. Speech is one thing; is actions that are the other. And in our society, I would strongly suggest that it's actions that should be punished. It's the people that rock up to someone's house, camp outside, clearly trying to intimidate them, clearly trying to harass them. That should be where we enforce the law, rather than merely saying X, Y, Z.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, hopefully the people on the Opera House steps on Monday don't take it any further. Although we did see yesterday, I believe, that a construction worker in Bellevue Hill was harassing some young guys who had an Israeli flag.
Yeah, I did see that case, and they've been arrested and
that's good
and charged.
Great.
Well, no, not charged, but what's interesting, I did hear that the bail conditions that were set for this particular guy who harassed these teenagers that had their Israeli flag was that he's not allowed to go into a neighborhood where there's Jews.
Yeah.
Which is I haven't heard of any such bail conditions being set ever before. So that's very interesting.
Yeah, it was. I noticed that too, and it's interesting because I've just moved into an area that's the most densely populated areas with Jewish people in the eastern suburbs. And yeah, I think for people familiar with the Jewish community, whether they love it or hate it, they know that there are lots of Jews who live there. Yeah. So I guess it does make sense. There are lots of synagogues around there.
Yeah.
And what do you think about, this is related but a bit of a tangent, I suppose, the issue of people moving here, or, often it's people like third or second generation children of migrants to Australia who don't ascribe to our values of free speech or of, freedom of religion, or do you think there's anything to be done? Do you think we should be discussing when it comes to that?
A few things. First is that I think in Australia we've done a very poor job of articulating and defending our values, in the sense that we've had this policy where we feel like just because someone's part of our, have joined our society, that they're going to share our values. To use Douglas Murray's phrase, if they touch the feet on the soil of Europe and suddenly have the ideas of Voltaire, that's just completely irrational. So I think we've done a very, very poor job in being strong in our own culture and our own values and really articulating that. And that's also the case with a lot of, I guess, these woke ideas, is that it really degrades our ability to be very strong in our values and our defense of free speech. And so I think that's one side of the coin, is that in Australia we don't do enough to articulate and educate incoming migrants, and also the younger generations as well, particularly in school and so on, that they don't understand why free speech is necessary. They don't understand why any of this is necessary. So I think that's one part of it, is that we're not doing enough in our culture to educate newcomers, be it by birth or by migration. I guess the other part of that is that we need to recognise that there's extreme differences of different cultures where people can come from. And in this regard, it doesn't help being politically correct, and also doesn't help having our free speech rights quashed, in the sense that we do need to articulate that there's very different cultures around free speech, rights of women, etc. And we can't assume that people coming here are going to necessarily think that our values are superior, particularly if we haven't articulated them, like I said before. So I think we really need to have a very honest conversation about who's coming to this country, what values are they coming with? Is that something? Is there some obligation that we should put on them to actually acquire our values? Where you can eat, multiculturalism, you can eat your own food, you can do your own celebrations, but in terms of the values that that's really something that we should be insisting on in our culture, I would say. Yeah.
I tend to agree.
Yeah.
And my opinion on that has changed since, the attack on Israel and the reaction here. It was something, like, I have a lot of friends who are interested in immigration and critiquing multiculturalism. And to be honest, I thought they were overblowing it. I thought perhaps they had, there was some racist motives, and, I'm the granddaughter of Greek migrants, and I was a bit sensitive to that, to be honest. Yeah. I still hung on to the idea that multiculturalism was amazing and faultless. And from, I guess I've been red-pilled on the issue. And
I was red-pilled some years ago. As I was saying, I had this very left-wing upbringing, and then I moved to Europe in 2014, and I was there 2015, 16. So that was when the full-blown migrant crisis was happening in Europe. And I usually use the example that I moved over to Europe reading The Guardian and came back reading The Spectator, because my views completely changed.
What country did you move to?
I was in the UK mostly, but I was going back and forward between different countries in Europe. I spent a lot of time in Germany as well during that time, so where the bulk of the migrants were coming from. And I have my stepdad's German, so I went and stayed with some of his family, and they were really experiencing in a small town in Germany how many migrants were coming in, what their experience was, and all this sort of stuff. So
I have heard that about Germany, and that it's really affecting some of the smaller towns. I know that Germans have quite a culture of saunas and spas, and like a lot of Northern Europeans, I suppose.
Yeah, that was a very interesting cultural moment for me, because the first day I arrived in Europe, I was staying with this guy, and he was like, "Oh, do you want to go to the sauna?" I'm like, "I just got after, an extremely long flight, and that sounded amazing." Yeah. And then just as we're walking in, he's like, "Oh, you do realize it's naked, like men and women in together naked?" I'm like, "Oh, no, I didn't, but that's okay. I'm not a prude."
Yeah. So Germans seem to be quite, that's a normal thing for them. And from what I've heard now with more migrants from other countries where it's, well, let's not beat around a bush. Like, a lot of the time women are veiled, let alone
completely naked in front of other men.
Yeah, and it's having quite an effect on on the women there and men, and it's unfortunate. And I've also been thinking a lot about, we talk about protecting certain cultures, like Indigenous cultures, or I think, a lot of Australians would support, the right for Japanese people to have their culture, or Chinese people. But when it comes to like white cultures, gets a bit more, people are more reticent to talk about it. Yeah. Even though, there are so many different, Anglo-Saxon cultures.
There's different European cultures.
Exactly.
Everyone that, this idea that Europe is completely homogenous, or, even the UK is completely basically, particularly if you're in Australia, you've not necessarily come here because your ancestors had it hunky-dory where they came from. So I really do object to labelling different groups as one more oppressed than the other, particularly if you go back through history. I mean, there's definitely things that have happened in more recent history, but at some point, everyone has been the oppressor and the oppressed, and it all comes out in the wash when you take a longer time frame with all these things.
So you wrote an article for Quillette in July of this year called The Great Misinformation Panic, and it's about a new draft law.
Mm-hmm.
Could you tell us a bit about that Misinformation Act?
Well, what's interesting is that we can get to the interesting part, but I'll explain what it is first. So Australia has proposed this draft legislation that intends to regulate misinformation and disinformation online. The mechanism by which they're going to do this is that ACMA, which is our main regulating body, a bit like, Ofcom and all these other equivalents in other countries, will enforce on the tech companies, particularly any kind of, tech-based platform. So this is really broad. It's your typical Twitter, Facebook, etc. But it can also cover things like dating platforms.
Okay.
So it covers basically any kind of interactive content aggregator of some description. So basically everything online is covered. Just assume you're covered, unless it's like a private message between two people. That's out. But so they've proposed this law where ACMA is going to regulate and enforce the various tech companies to have a code whereby they work out how they're going to label and remove misinformation and disinformation. There's a few problems with this. The first is that there are some exemptions to this law, so it's not going to cover every single piece of information that is put out online. It's very, I would say, elitist in the sense that it's excluding media organizations. So mainstream media organizations are excluded. Government is excluded. Any educational institutions are excluded. There's some. I mean, that in particular is causing some issues because what if you're a professor? Clearly, you're not covered if you're just posting about your research. But if you're, the University of, Sydney or something like that, and you're posting, then you're covered. Right. So, it's a bit iffy, but I assume that's how it's going to play. Is that if you're an individual, even if you have a certain expertise, then you're still, you're still liable to be hit with these. So it also means that if you have a problem with, particular research that your university is putting out and you want to refute some findings, then technically you probably are going to be hit as well if you're a professor. The other thing is that the mainstream media organizations, so that would obviously exclude places like Quillette, places like Substack, new media organizations will not have the protections of the exemptions that they have given under this legislation.
So, sorry, to be clear, mainstream media organizations are protected, and publications like Quillette are not.
Yes.
So it's coming down harder on independent
news. New any kind of new organization is going to be hit harder.
We need to be hit any harder.
I know, right? Yeah. So that's one issue, is that it's very unequal the way it's dealing with different institutions. So it's very much the case that they're preferencing legacy institutions, which, as we all know, can be fallible. They do get things wrong. They do very much get things wrong. And the fact that independent organizations aren't afforded these protections, particularly because they're the ones that often question a lot of the legacy, a lot of the information that's put out by the legacy institutions. And often, when that happens, there eventually becomes a reckoning and the truth will out, so to speak. So that's a really disturbing part of it. The other issue is that it's just simply unfeasible, I would say, that the idea that particularly organizations like Substack or DuckDuckGo that have a particular focus on free speech or privacy, the idea that they're just going to go along with this is, I think, laughable, because Australia is such a small market. More likely they will just wipe out Australian access, and you'll have to, if you want to use these platforms, go through a VPN or something like this, which means that actually the technology is already there to circumvent. If people know that they're going to be censored, if they know they're going to have their information diet monitored to such an extent, then at least for the savvy people, that's just an incentive to go out and get a VPN so that they can access media that is going to be denied to them. So
is there a chance that this law won't be passed?
Well, yeah, actually, it's got an insane amount of submissions to it.
Okay.
Last I checked, they're still uploading the submissions that they've gotten, because they said they were going to upload them all, but because they're so voluminous, they haven't actually uploaded all. So given the amount of feedback that has been offered, and not just to ordinary Joe Blows, or like I wrote as part of the Free Speech Union against this legislation, but really other departments as well. So like the Human Rights Commission, which I just told you, has gone after people for offensive speech. They have actually written in response to this draft legislation against it.
Interesting.
So it's not all coming from, independent sources. It's also coming from a lot of legacy information institutions as well.
So if people are interested in the Free Speech Union Australian branch or joining it, how can they do?
You can go to freespeechunion.au and you can use the code Quillette and you can get 25% off of your membership for that.
Great. Yeah. Okay, well, I hope to see you at an All-1 event in the future, or something. I'm not sure if the Free Speech Union will do events as well.
Yes, we're planning on doing some events in Sydney. So, yeah, you're obviously welcome to come along to that as well.
Great.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks for coming on Quillette, etc.
Well, welcome. Thank you.